hope. You're more than welcome to come a little bit closer to the front here so it feels more like a packed house for these nice people who are here with us. I'm going to serve as the moderator for this evening's event. My name is Jason Robert. I'm a professor in the School of Life Sciences. I'm the Lincoln Professor of Ethics and Biotechnology and Medicine. I'm also the Director of the Bioscience Ethics Policy and Law Program in Life Sciences. And we're joined this evening by 5 very talented people from across the university campus who are going to talk to us about this problem of feeding 8 billion. The format that we're going to follow is that I'm going to be asking some questions, and the first question, maybe even the first couple of questions, are designed for everybody, and then some of the other questions, 1 or 2 people might want to put up their hands and jump in with that. We'd like to encourage some participation from the audience, but we're going to do that in a civilized way, which means that you are going to fill out these little cards. I think that they've been circulating, right? These little cards, they're in the back if you need them. You can fill out one of these little cards with a question that's legible, and then I will go through them and ask as many as I can before we run out of time. This is an event that's been put on by the ASU Biotechnology Club, which is an undergraduate student club, and they have done, I think, a tremendous job pulling this together. The Bioethics Policy and Law Program kicked in a little bit of money to pay for bagels and fruit and stuff, but that's really all we did to support this. In addition to partnering with us, the group has also partnered with the Arizona Sci-Tech Festival, and there are some representatives from the festival here. They've got some surveys and stuff if you want to fill those out. And if you want to know more about the Sci-Tech Festival, which is running from January 25th all the way through March 14th, you can go to azscitechfest.org, and that will give you all the details on the hundreds of events, I think, that are being planned over this 6-week period. So, with that said, what I'm going to do is call these folks up one at a time so they can take their seats, and we're going to get going. So first up is Dr. Charles Arntzen, who is co-director of the Center for Infectious Diseases and Vaccinology at the Biodesign Institute here at ASU. The second person I'm going to call up, we're going to go semi-alphabetically here, is Marci Baranski. Marci is a PhD student in biology with a focus on biology and society, and has an undergraduate degree in biochemistry. The third person I'm going to call up is Roberto Gaxiola, who is an assistant professor of cellular and molecular biosciences here in the School of Life Sciences at ASU. Our fourth participant is Dr. Ben Hurlbut, who is a historian of science and is an assistant professor in the Center for Biology and Society in the School of Life Sciences in the program that I work on. And then our fifth speaker, we had a sixth, but he was sick. The fifth speaker is Dr. Rolf Halden from the School of Sustainable Engineering in the Built Environment. Is that right? And he also directs a center in the Biodesign Institute, as I understand it.
Associate Director.
Sorry, Associate Director.
And Interim Director of Center for Health Information.
Oh my goodness, and he's got a whole bunch of other stuff going on too. So, what we're going to do tonight, as I say, is proceed with some opening questions just to get the conversation going. And the most important kind of question we all agree on the panel here is to frame this. What is the question of how do we feed 8 billion people a question about? What kind of problem is the problem of feeding 8 billion? Is it a technical problem, an economic one, a political problem, a social problem, a moral problem? So let's suppose that it's all of those, which it could very well be. What's the best way to think about it? How should we be tackling this? What kind of expertise is required to address the problem? Depending on how you frame it, you're going to come up with different answers to that question. So, Dr. Arntzen, I turn it over to you to answer the question, what kind of problem is feeding 8 billion?
Well, it's a problem that's different around different parts of the world. Crop production in the developed world, particularly in the US, but I'd say in parallel in Canada, Australia, and recently in Brazil, and developed agricultural areas has been going up dramatically for the last 50 years. For the major crop species, I see nothing indicating that we're going to slow down the rate of increase of crop yields. So ours is probably more of an integrated technical crop breeding answer. If you go to sub-Saharan Africa, and if there is any time, I've got some pictures from Tanzania last year, pictures of women doing the harvesting, doing the separation of the chickpeas from the husks by hand, no mechanization, no tractors. So we've got big blocks of the world that are non-industrial agriculture. Agriculture pretty much as it was 100, 200 years ago. And then we've got sort of emerging areas of the world, probably some of the most important, China and India in particular, because of the size of their population, and Indonesia to some extent because they're also huge, that have adopted new technology but are limited in application of all aspects of mechanization, use of chemicals for fertilizer, pesticides, etc., limited by economic constraints in the societal organization they have of relatively small farms, low capital ability, difficult to make investments in what is necessary to move the next step up. Perhaps the best in solving this is China, since they have the ability to do top-down management from central government and are moving very rapidly into what we would call industrial type agriculture. And in response, China's food production is going up dramatically. So I'd simply say it depends on where you are. And for the developed world, I don't see any problem in providing the food and feed and fiber that we need as we go for the next 25, 30, well, probably 20 years or less to get to 8 billion. It's not a problem. But if you start looking at other parts of the world where the major growth is going to be, again, it's India, Indonesia, Nigeria, the hugely populated countries, and some parts of this, it's a basket case, and I think we got real problems.
Thank you. Marci.
Well, first of all, I think it's important to look at it from this approach of food systems as a whole. So you can split it up into agricultural production and food consumption, but really we're operating in a globalized food system. So there are obviously different challenges in different parts of the world. But if you look at the food system, I think the two most important things are technological and social. Technological because in the past century we've seen tremendous technological innovation that has literally changed how we get food, how we eat food, how we produce food. Coupled with that is institutional change, so change in organizations, from the agricultural research organizations to political institutions to how people own land or hire workers. And then I guess that sort of gets into the social side of it. So food security is one of these buzzwords coming up. If people can't afford to buy food, then obviously they're going to go hungry, no matter how much food that we produce. So looking at things like food prices, which is an economic question, but it's intimately tied to social spheres, gender equity, both in agricultural production and how, even how a family decides to buy food or how they use their money. So I think a combination of social and technical would be most important to me.
Thanks, Marci. Roberto.
Well, I think I agree with all the points you have made, and I just would like to add another one. I think it's a biological. Plants are not designed to produce food for us. Since the beginning of agriculture, we have learned to tweak plants so they produce food for us. We don't eat natural foods. Nobody in the world eats natural foods. Most of our foods have been domesticated. And now we have very elegant tools to domesticate the food, the plants. And basically, I will resume it to a very simple, could be a simple approach. If we can learn to enhance the capacity of the plants to fix CO2, make carbohydrates, and move these carbohydrates to the different sides of the plant, so the plant yield is enhanced, we are going to be able to do agriculture in marginal regions of the world. That's where I see the major problem. If we can start regaining some marginal regions of the world that have been devastated because of the Green Revolution, lateral or collateral effects.
Ben.
So agreeing, I think, with most of what's been said, I'll do what I'm good at doing and try to complicate things. So it seems to me that it is a problem of all those things on the list. And yet, it is possible to frame the problem in terms of one or two or three of those things on the list, as is often done. And it seems to me that one of the kind of core challenges with issues in this area is not so much identifying what kind of problem it is, but figuring out how those different dimensions fit together. Because when we make decisions about focusing on problems as technical problems, we're in effect not focusing on these problems as social problems, or as political problems, or as problems of governance, or as moral problems. So I mean, it seems to me that this is a remarkably interesting and kind of complex domain, because it's a place where something is sort of as individualistic and subjective as taste bumps up against a kind of global economy and problems of global governance. And so I think at the heart of this challenge is not simply producing enough calories, but understanding the kind of forms of interconnectedness, forms of heterogeneity and difference that exist sort of around food as a thing people do. And to think about the kinds of politics, basically, that we need to address this kind of problem. So in other words, when we ask the question, how can we feed 8 billion people? One of the sort of core questions there is, who's we? Because depending on whether you imagine it as a technical, economic, moral, political, social problem, that we changes.
Thanks, Ben. Rolf.
Good evening.
Good evening.
So there's two problems. The first problem is that I'm last in line, and it doesn't get any easier to answer. I see the big problem as the problem that we are currently investing 25 calories of fossil fuel into every calorie of food that ends up on the table. If you think about that, then we can't even feed all the people that are here in the room today, and maybe we can feed significantly less people. So there's an issue with energy that drives questions there. The other issue is the sustainability. We can feed 10 billion people for a day, for a year, but the question really is, how long do we want to feed those people, and that will drive our decision, right? I think there's biotechnologies that will enable us to feed a lot of people short time, but we don't know what the externalities of that process is. So, and that brings us to the social issues that Ben touched on. So socially, how are we going to reach decisions that enable us to move forward and create a society that can be sustained for, ideally for an eternity, or until this planet will collapse. So these are really big questions. So we have to address soil loss. We have to address overuse of water resources in the US and worldwide. And we have to address the fact that today the decision makers in food production are separated from the land that gets affected by the decisions they reach. If you think back in history, people had a very close link to their land. We have separated that link, and now decision makers sit there and make decisions about places they haven't even seen. And so it's like, the psychological test. If you sit in a room and you don't see the prisoner, you torture them to death, right, by pressing a button. So psychologically, it's very challenging to still connect ethically to things that are, globalized, that are around the world that you don't see. And I think that there's probably some of the key issues that we're facing in that realm of social, behavioral aspects.
So this is a complicated problem. What should 8 billion people eat? We can start with you, Rolf, if you prefer, so that we don't have to have you answer the question last.
All right.
What should 8 billion people eat?
Well, let's ask the audience. How about a burger?
Burger?
Burger.
Oh, burger.
So for beef production, there's 40 calories go into one calorie of food protein. So that's not sustainable. We would be all better off if we eat less meat, right? If we would avoid meat completely. But even if we would go completely vegetarian, there's still issues. So everybody, I think we would all make the right decision if we eat less meat as a nation, because we are going to, what is it, I think 250 pounds of meat per person per day in America. That's a baby through a senior citizen. That's a lot of meat. I think we can all do with less.
250 pounds per person.
Per year, sorry. It looks like it's time for me to pass over this microphone.
No, I mean, I think that, so I guess I answer that question two ways. One is to point out some of the same sorts of things that Rolf just pointed out. So if we think about food as a kind of global system, so we ask what are the inputs and what are the outputs, it seems crazy. I mean, the idea of eating a hamburger seems crazy. So on one level, the answer to that question, at least for certain major actors in American capitalism, is McDonald's, right, or Kentucky Fried Chicken or whatever, right? I mean, the notion that you know, there is major investment in the status quo and an effort to leverage that status quo to be profitable, right, and also sort of serve people's preferences. But if you look at the big picture, I think something like 75% of the agricultural land in the world goes into making meat. So between the growing feedstock and land that's used for grazing, I mean, really is an enormous amount of, that's an enormous majority of the world's agricultural activities, particularly given the fact that there are plenty of people who don't eat much meat at all. So I think on one level, there are these sort of deep contradictions that need to be thought about, and not thought about merely on the level of sort of individual preference, or merely on the level of the dynamics of the market. On the other hand, it seems to me that taking this sort of global level view, you miss certain things. And the question sort of, what should people eat? I mean, it seems to me it demands a lot of differentiation, right? I mean, what is eating? Is eating consumption of calories? Okay, it is that. But it's also, you know, the basis of critically important social activities, right? It's a basis of sociality. It's a basis of community. It has history in it, right? It has identity. It has meaning in it that goes way beyond the making a calorie available to your body. So I mean, I think asking what should people eat requires us to ask, you know, sort of, how should we ask people what should people eat? How can we have a conversation as a whole bunch of local, even individuals with taste, about these kinds of problems, about problems at a kind of macroscopic level.
Roberto, what should 8 billion people eat?
Ideally good food. And that's actually, I think it's doable. I think, I mean, I completely agree that if we invest most of our fertile lands into lands for cows and sheep and pigs and all that stuff, and I am a carnivorous, I mean, I don't see a day without meat, but anyway, I might. That's not a good investment, but there are other things that we also have to consider, and it's actually, we cannot tell people what they should eat, because we cannot change customs. I mean, you cannot bring to the sub-Saharan Africa, a brand new food made in the United States, because they are not going to eat it. They might not like the flavor, it's not their use, they are used to the tradition of how they prepare the food and whatever. So why don't we actually focus, for example, in what they normally eat? They eat cassava. Cassava is a very efficient, water use efficient plant, but it has a little problem. It has several problems. One of the main problems is it has the protein content in the storage route is very poor. Can we change that? Yes, we can. And we can with very simple genetic engineering approaches that are already in trial. They have already shown at least field trials with mice that actually functions. Again, that's my idea. My idea is, well, can we improve the quality of the food we produce? And also, can we make those plants more efficient in their take of nitrate, phosphate, other minerals like iron, zinc, whatever, and at the same time also try to make them more resistant to plagues. Because that's where we also, when we abuse the use of insecticides and pesticides, we end up killing the soil. Not only the bad bugs, but also the good bugs that are in the soil ecosystem that are necessary for the plant. So I think there are many things we can do, and I think we're doing them.
Marci, do you have an answer to the question, what should 8 billion people eat?
I don't know what 8 billion people should eat, but I have a comment about the question, which is that this is a fundamental question of sustainability. And the idea of sustainability is that each person should be able to preserve their own future opportunities and opportunities for their children. You know, opportunities of whatever people are sort of part of your circle. But at the same time, you shouldn't limit the opportunities of others. So if I want to eat McDonald's every day, I might have it in my own interest to preserve that opportunity, but I'm limiting the opportunities of a lot of others by doing that. So at the same time, while thinking about, you know, access to healthy food and fresh food and cheap food, I think that that is one of the key challenges, is sustainability in food production and consumption.
So you do have an answer. Healthy, fresh, and cheap food. That's what you need. Charlie.
Well, I don't like the question. It implies that if I were to respond, what should they eat, that I should have some influence on what anybody eats. That people should eat what they want and what they can afford. And it's the last component that's the most important as we get to 8 billion people. Wealth is unequally distributed around the world, and our ability to feed people is dependent upon capital investment in agriculture. Well, that's going to determine not what they should eat, but what they can eat. And so, I can't answer it as phrased. I cannot answer.
I think that's very helpful, actually, because it gets us back to the difficulty of the kinds of questions that we're asking here. A question that seems so simple on its face turns out to be, in fact, really remarkably complex. We don't have to go in order now, and you don't have to have an answer for the rest of the questions. But I'm gonna just put a few more on the table. What do you take to be the most promising technology for addressing the need to feed 8 billion? Roberto, I think you already hinted. Genetic engineering of plants to produce, especially plants, to produce higher protein content, less demand for nitrate and phosphate.
And water.
Less demand for water, and so on. Did I get you right there?
I think that's part of the answer, but on the other hand, you cannot forget the whole, this is a very complex system, so you have to also count with people that know about watering systems, engineering, and it's a very complex system. It's not just you make transgenic plants and that will solve the problem. No. You have to have a very, how do you say, integral take. For example, I will give you an example of a grant we're writing as we speak. This is a grant where the group is trying to recover phosphates from your food. And we're going to use that to fertilize your corn. Will taste good and phosphate. And they'll do a good job. So, as you can see, it's just getting married to technologies that are actually facing one big problem, phosphate availability.
Other promising technologies? Or is this going to have to be, like Roberto just hinted, it's going to have to be a question of socio-technical systems coming together, integrated systems to address these issues? Charlie?
Well, again, I'll go back. It depends on where you are.
Right.
In the U.S., probably the biggest technological advancement that would help the food supply of the world would be something having to do with renewable energy, because we're subsidizing farmers today in the forms of bioethanol to, it's really subsidy to get, to keep the corn prices up. So we can create an artificial demand for corn by converting it into ethanol to burn in cars. It's a screwy thing to do, but it's politically attractive. It keeps the Midwesterners voting for whoever votes for this stuff. So if we had a breakthrough in energy production, and it could be natural gas, as is coming along, it could be solar energy, it could be a whole series of things, I think there would be a good possibility that the political motivation would move away from bioethanol, freeing up loads of corn, which we can now export. We need to improve our export ratio, and we can provide more corn to, especially to China and the burgeoning populations of Asia, which want to feed it to grow chickens and pigs and aquaculture, etc. Pardon?
We need a Mexico.
Yeah, in Mexico. The Mexicans will take care of it. But I'm just saying, it depends upon where you are. In other parts of the world, sub-Saharan Africa, probably the biggest technical advancements will be in roads and distribution systems, because there's no economic incentive to increase agricultural production because you can't get it from the farm to the city. So it may have nothing to do with biology. It just depends upon where you are. And probably the looming problem is water supply, fresh water supply to grow crops. And the technology there may be desalinization, or it may be some totally different thing than we're thinking about today. But again, it all relates back to capital availability and our ability to put capital into something that's going to make a transformative change in the way we produce our food, how we distribute our food, or other things.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think that information technology will play a major role in making things happen. It sounds like a silly idea. Why would the ability to communicate help us in feeding people? It doesn't put food on the table. But I think if we take a little poly, who has read the Omnivore's Dilemma? So who has heard about it? Oh, you're just proving me wrong. So it's not a whole lot of people more. But typically what happens is that if you have a conduit and a way of communicating information that allows ideas to incubate, that allows people to think about, to evaluate their behavior. And I believe that we have to change our behavior, whether what we eat, how much we eat, and when we feel we are satisfied. This all has to change for our own health, but also for the health of the planet. And I think that internet technology has an important role in that.
Other thoughts? All right, then what are some of the obstacles standing in the way of moving forward on these different kinds of technologies that we've been hearing about? I promise to pick on you if you don't say anything, Roberto. What's standing in the way of so we're talking about fuel, we're talking about genetic engineering, we're talking about information technology, and a whole bunch more.
I think Charles already hit what's in the way. Politics.
Politics is in the way.
Interest of big capitals. That's in the way.
Other thoughts?
Well, I think that would be already tabled two very different approaches. I think I heard from Charlie that he said that countries like China that are more centralized are in a better position to rapidly go the right path, right? Did I understand that correctly, Charlie?
Well, I don't say it's right, but it's doable. If you have top-down management, you can get a whole 1 billion people to fall in line and do things. I didn't say that's right. It's just, they've been very successful. China's population is approaching a leveling off point. What have they done to accomplish that? I don't think it could be done anywhere else in the world. It certainly could not be done in the most populous nations, Indonesia, India, Nigeria, Brazil. There's no way any of those countries could ever have top-down management saying you're only going to have one child, and there's consequences if you have more than one. only in China could you carry that out. Now, whether China could do that today is probably unlikely because of the information freedoms and other things, but they were able to do some things politically that if you stand way back and don't look at individual rights, you gotta say it's good for the planet. What they did is a darn good thing. They're leveling off the population in the largest country in the world. They're reaching a sustainable level of food supply, albeit with lots of imports from around the world, but they've got something about $10 trillion of U.S. money in their bank, so they can afford to buy a fair amount of stuff. Well, I don't know where I'm wandering off to. I'm thinking about, is politics good or bad? It depends upon if you want to look at it from the distance of the moon and seeing a healthier planet, or if you want to get up close and think about personal rights. It's usually different. Sort of an opposite extreme of top-down management is Zimbabwe. Not Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe with Mugabe. Rhodesia, before he came in, was the breadbasket of Africa, producing way more food than they needed, exporting throughout the region. Mugabe comes in with his crazy top-down politics and cronyism and corruption. Today they are importing most of the food that they consume. It's just, they've destroyed agriculture in a 40-year period. It's just probably closer to a 25-year period. So you can do all sorts of things with top-down management. Some are, well, you just can't say right or wrong. It's just, they exist. And they accomplish totally different things.
Rolf, did you want to follow up on that?
No, next question.
Roberto. Thanks, Ben.
I mean, it seems to me that there's actually two very different positions that have been articulated here, right? I mean, Rolf suggested that information technology is an important technology in this domain because it allows shifts in political will, effectively. That's what you said. Changes in ideas, cultural movement, right? And it potentially allows for exchange of ideas on a level, in a form that might not have been possible otherwise, might not have been possible before we faced these kinds of problems as global problems rather than as national or regional or local problems, right? So I mean, I think asking the question, is politics good or bad? It seems to me sort of like asking the question, is technological change good or bad? It's sort of a silly way, it's a wrong-headed way to ask the question, because, I mean, as Charlie put it, that you can do different things with the same approaches to governance. But it seems to me the same can be said about technologies, right? I mean, you do different things with the same technologies, and I think what Roberto was saying was that, yeah, I mean, you can make a cassava that has more protein. Yeah. But it's only going to do what it's supposed to do if you can make that cassava grow in the place where it's supposed to grow and be eaten by the people who are supposed to eat it. And those people are in effect a component of that technology, right? But probably a better way to think about them is as a social community, right? And so that technology is never going to exist independent of a social community that, you know, plants it in the ground, grows it up, and eats it for dinner, right? So I mean, it seems to me that I mean, I like your suggestion that information technology is the most important technology. It's in a sense a way of putting those people back in the picture as the actors who are play the kind of critical role in figuring out whether it happens or not. Now, it seems to me that it's very important to ask how we think about that community. What forms of idea exchange do we foster? At what levels do decisions get made? Because it clearly is the case that you can get a lot done if you get a bunch of smart people in a room who say, like, what's the best thing to do for this billion people for the next 10 years, and figure it out and do it, as opposed to asking this billion people what they want to eat for dinner when they happen to be walking down the strip and you know, passing this or that restaurant, and they make their decision, and on aggregate this drives the direction.
Well, but I mean, you're here kind of going a little bit in a dream world, no? The same thing we don't live in a dream world. We live in a world where you have uneven opportunity of education. And I think people that have had the privilege of being educated have also the responsibility of bringing something back to the world. And that is technology. Sometimes technology translated as new medicines, as new ways of healing people, and the other technology could be how to desalinize water. And that will actually help the whole world. But again, I still think that very often we hit the wall when we hit policymakers that have a deep pocket and they don't want to change the way things go.
All right, I have to go back. So I actually don't like this great divide that has been opened now between Charlie and me, because I do believe that if the right person were at the top and had the power to implement all the right decisions, we wouldn't be for that. My trust into the politicians isn't as profound as the knowledge that, you know, if the right person was at the top, we would have get the right system. And so I think the issue is that, again, it's a measure of time that we consider for making this decision. Politicians make their decisions, you know, on an election cycle, whatever. There's very few people who are willing to look 100 years into the future and then make decisions based on that and make all the sacrifices that come with them. Because we are not very good at sacrificing today. In fact, we are indulgent. And we have to learn a very different lifestyle as in our society here to accommodate all these people.
It's about austerity. Is that what you're saying? About?
Being European, well, maybe.
No, I totally disagree that we have to step back. I think our economy can continue to grow. Our well-being can continue to grow. If we ever give up hope in that, then I feel that our society will really tumble. And that's been the strength of the, we'll say it nationalistically, the U.S. system is we have hope that we are going to improve things for our children and our grandchildren. Things will keep getting better, and I believe that'll happen. That said, I'm trying to get back to agreeing with Rolf. He was talking about information technology, or really communication, and how important it's transformative. There was a really neat study by the World Bank I first saw it a few months ago, and I don't know when it came out. But they did analyses in India, in various segments of India, and were trying to tease out why some areas had increased crop or agricultural production, everything from chickens to cereal grains, etc. And of all things, they related it back to cell phones, because the communities that got a cell phone could communicate with markets, and when they knew where to bring their products, and rather than just giving it to a middleman who took it for a low price and didn't give any incentive for further production, they worked out their own way for a market-driven agricultural stimulation. So the technology had nothing to do with the seed or anything else. It's walking around with a cell phone, being able to call somebody in Delhi or Hyderabad or someplace else and say, you want to buy my chickens? That works. So that goes back to what works here is a market-driven decision-making process. Farmers, by and large, plant the crops from which they're going to make money, or in the case of ethanol, from which you're going to get subsidized by the government. But it's still how much money the farmer is going to make, and where is the best guarantee in the marketplace. And that is it's wonderful if you have information and a communication system that allows you to make those decisions, whether you're in the U.S. or you're in the Punjab or you're in someplace along the coast in Tanzania or wherever it might be.
So two things come immediately to mind in listening to this conversation. One of them, in terms of information, has to do with intellectual property, and another one, in terms of politics, has to do with other sources of interest and investment in this domain, and that's the role of private companies. So, Marci, did you want to say anything about what we've just been talking about, or should I start with you on the next question?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, so here's the question. what do you think are the implications of the role, the increasing role, really, of private industry in the agricultural domain, especially in global agricultural research and seed sales?
So to give a little bit of background, I think that there's this sort of narrative that a lot of the great innovations in agriculture come from these public research institutions, which a lot of them do, because public research institutions can invest in really basic research that a private seed company wouldn't invest in because it's not profitable right away. But a lot of the innovations have come from private industry and private and public industry, well, research coming together. But I think that there's, on one hand, we sort of want to villainize, Monsanto and intellectual property. On the other hand, a lot of the innovations that we've seen are coming from these private research firms. So intellectual property and investment in technologies and the divide between public and private is something that I think is going to be really important to agricultural innovation in the next few years in dealing with intellectual property. So on one hand, intellectual property protects inventors or a plant breeder or someone who's doing biotechnology. It protects their innovation. On the other hand, it can be a barrier for widespread adoption of that technology, whatever it is. So there's a lot of debate over something like golden rice, which is supposed to be, agricultural research for public good. It's something that golden rice has increased vitamin A, so it would help a lot of people who are lacking vitamin A. But it's this weird sort of synergy between the private institution, public research, who has rights to it, who has to pay for the intellectual property. So I guess I'll leave it at that.
And that opens up, I think, a lot of areas. Anybody else want to comment on this question?
Yeah,
Go ahead, Roberto.
I think she's right on the money. I mean, basically, it's very naive what I'm going to say and very utopic.
And you've already chastised me for not living in the real world.
I'm going to beyond. If we have the privilege of being educated, and we are supposed to be interested in the well-being of the society, everything that we invent should belong to the society and not to a private company, not to a university, not to a person. Because if we hadn't the resources, we would be able to develop anything. I think that one of the big stones we're hitting that is preventing the advance of this kind of research and the benefits for the people is exactly that the lawyers enter into the equation.
And
sorry, I mean, like lawyers, my mother is a lawyer.
Okay. This may be a little abstract, but I think Roberto just put this on the table, so I got to address it. So he says these things, public goods should belong to the public. Right?
yes,
They should belong to us, not to some subset. Jason, can you put up my pictures?
yes.
So I think you guys should do this. So put up that first one first.
Yes.
Okay, so the issue that Marci raises, I think, is connected to, or sort of is in a subset of questions that about kind of globalization, or rather about the relationships between different kinds of actors in this world, right? So do we think about it as scientists and the rest of society? Do we think about it as countries to countries? Do we think about it as private sector to public sector? Do we think about it as producers to consumers, et cetera, et cetera? Lots of different ways of carving things up, okay? And I think in my line of work, we often look at controversy, because controversy, you can learn a lot from controversy. It sort of causes stuff to erupt that is otherwise kind of settled there and below the surface and therefore hard to see. So one really interesting controversy to look at, specifically this domain, is a European opposition to genetically modified crops in the 90s, basically 90s and sort of onward. So this is in front of Parliament here. Everybody recognize this? What part of no GMO did you not understand? This moment in British history was touched off, or was exacerbated significantly by a little stunt that Greenpeace pulled, which I was very, very fond of. They dumped 4 tons of soybeans in front of 10 Downing Street and put up a sign that said, this was in '99, I think, that said, "Tony, don't swallow Bill's seed." You may remember the political controversy that was taking place in this country at that time. You get the joke. But that was, apart from being very clever, was a statement about sovereignty, right? I mean, it's a statement about the reach of American capitalism, which from a British perspective you see as sort of global capitalism, right? I mean, institutions like Monsanto that in a sense don't seem to be bounded by place, reaching into a society where the kind of, you know, the agricultural life is a sort of feature, as a deep feature of national identity, right? And I mean, I think you look at that controversy, and I mean, it's been characterized as a problem of sort of public ignorance and distrust of innovation, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, we can talk about that, but it's undeniable that a deep feature of it was about who the we is, right? Who is us and who is them, and how do we set up boundaries? And this became a site of that kind of controversy. So in a sense, it wasn't so much about the soybeans themselves as what the soybeans making their way into Britain it involved. Can you go to the next? Okay, so in France, you had a very different, you had a similar kind of controversy, but of a very different nature. In France, there were large, very large scale field trials of, I mean, France is sort of the origin of biotechnology, right? I mean, France is where molecular biology effectively was invented. And this is not a sort of anti-science and technology society. What's that?
It wasn't done.
Okay. All right.
It was in Belgium.
In France, there was, through the 80s and well into the 90s, there were lots of genetically modified crops growing, right? And suddenly, over a fairly short period of time, this really massive public controversy erupted, right? And what was the controversy about? It was not about having genetically modified crops in France. It was about the relationship between those plots of genetically modified crops and everybody else's crops, right? And it was framed in terms of French political ideals, right? So in a sense, there was the notion that, can you go to the next slide? There's a notion that so here's genetically modified corn, non-genetically modified corn, the coexistence of genetically modified, non-genetically modified agriculture, the Chernobyl syndrome, agricultural version. At the boundary, the wind dies, the pollen becomes, okay, so this is the required distance between modified and non-modified pigs, right? So at the boundary, the wind dies, the pollen becomes sterile, the bees make a U-turn, contamination is impossible. This concern about contamination was not a concern about risk to health and safety. It was a concern about the contamination of one sort of entity, one agent, one person, as it were. The scientists or the industry actors, whatever, who were cultivating the modified crop, and the farmer down the road, whose crops were going to get contaminated. In effect, it was a violation of what French society saw as the appropriate political relations between members of that society. Okay, so it was effectively a threat to the we, to the French we. That was the, if you go back to the previous slide, that's what the message here. So I mean, it seems to me that this is important, and IP is a place where we're sort of trying to figure this out and think about this, right? What are the appropriate forms of relationships between us's, more traditional us's, in a global community?
Well, I mean, let me just make a little bit a comment on your comment.
Talk right into the mic.
Let me make a comment on your comment. This story actually was even more dramatic in Canada, where growers that were growing their normal canola got sued later on because they were using transgenic canola. They never planted transgenic canola, but of course it was cross-pollinated. And again, here is the technology is good, they wouldn't be angry of having a transgenic canola that now is actually, I think it was BT resistant, so pest resistant, you have to use less pesticides, is more ecological friendly, but now you have to pay to a company and you never bought the seeds.
Do you understand what happened?
Cross-pollination.
Guy's growing stuff, he saves the seeds, he replants, turns out it's genetically modified because of cross-pollination. The company takes him to court and
And
says
I mean, and this is a very different example.
They took him to court because he sold.
oh, he sold it because
He sold seeds.
Yeah, they found actually they sold seeds, but the guys didn't really, well, I don't know if they knew or not, but the situation is very different than what happened in Brazil. Brazil was against GMOs, and Argentina was using GMOs, and there was smuggling of GMOs seeds up to Brazil, and then Brazil started flourishing. What the government of Brazil did is adopted GMOs. And we can see now the economy of Brazil really in pretty good shape. And agriculture is one of the strongest points.
Rolf, maybe, I think this is a very, very, very difficult question about IP rights in this realm, but it goes back to scale. I think if we allow a monopoly for somebody to have on any given food, then we're dead in the water. And if as we are moving toward that, we got to figure out a way of how to avoid it in an ethically and a way, and it won't come from kind of top down, but we just got to understand something. There's some common resources, some common goods you don't mess with. We see a similar situation with water, where water rights are being brought up, and what used to be a common good, is diminished and goes away. We will end up in civil war if we have situations where you don't have access to air, water, and food anymore. So, we gotta watch out for this, and it's a challenge.
So if you have any questions, please be writing them down on those little scraps of paper, and Matt's gonna circulate and pick them up. So if you got one, make sure it gets past to the end or the middle. I'm gonna ask a question of Charlie right now, real quick. Charlie said before that in America, feeding the American population is a trivial problem as compared with other kinds of places, including sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere. And so the question that some Americans might ask is, why should Americans then care about the problem of feeding anybody beyond our boundaries, beyond our borders, and not just Canadians and Mexicans, but everybody else? Why should Americans care about feeding 8 billion? Any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, we should be very selfish. We want a growing economy around the world because we are a global economy, and our success in the U.S. is increasingly on selling abroad value-added products. They can be jet airplanes from Boeing, they could be computers from Apple or anybody else, but value-added products require markets where people are well-fed and are making money. And making money implies that they're well-fed, they have jobs, etc. So we want stability around the world, meaning people are, and this also means political stability. And the best way to achieve that is if people are well-fed. So it's in our best interest for our economy to grow so that there's more jobs for our kids and our grandkids, etc., that the rest of the world is growing along with us. And I think that's been a general policy in the past, and we have to maintain it.
Other thoughts?
And I just emphasize, I don't believe in altruism. I don't believe that we will do it because we should. We will do it because it's good for us, and we will have a better quality of life if the rest of the world has a better quality of life. And there's nothing wrong with that sort of selfishness, at least in my view.
Charles, I mean, I agree. I think that's the main engine of the United States economy, but I think now there is an example of altruism going on by these foundations of Gates and Buffett. Those foundations are really investing in medicine. Gates is moving to agriculture. Buffett is into agriculture. I know that, I mean, they're not paying taxes on that, on that kind of money, but I think they're doing the right thing, and maybe it's to protect their own economy. That might be the thing behind. But in a sense, I think we need to be altruistic. I just consider to be altruistic just as a normal human being. It has to be part of your way of being, but that's my personal take.
Yeah. I'm not saying I'm not altruistic, I'm just saying that is not what is going to drive us to share food with the rest of the world. In the end, it is really the economic well-being and our personal well-being and our anticipated well-being of our progeny that we think about.
Maybe I want to pick up on your comment that it's easy right now to feed, the population that we have, 320 million people in America. But I guess the question again is, how long can we do this? Do you think it's sustainable? So my understanding is that we lose topsoil at the rate of 10 times at which it is formed. And we are depleting the groundwater sources, for example, in the Corn Belt, where we are pumping the Ogallala aquifer. And so a lot of the food we produce will be here in the short term, probably in our lifespan. But it will not be there in the, in 100, 200 years out. And that creates a problem. So how do we have to make our decision on what time horizon?
Well, so, yeah, let's try to get to full scale. Yeah. So I'm going to show you grain yields. I can stand up so I can. So here's corn in the United States. So I remember my dad planting corn in, well, I can remember it in the 60s, so I was around before that. The great technological advance that came in the 1940s in corn or maize production was hybrid corn. Since then, yields have been going up. There's absolutely no indication that those yields are going up. And we have roughly about the same amount of cropland in the U.S. It goes down slightly because of urbanization and encroachment on farmland, etc. So I see nothing that's going to stop that from going up. Now, the introduction of hybrid corn back down here in the 40s was really the public sector. University of Illinois, University of Wisconsin, a little bit of Minnesota, Cornell, that's where hybrid corn concept came from. But it was private companies, and today the two remaining dominant ones are Pioneer and DeKalb, Pioneer, which is part of DuPont, and DeKalb, which was purchased by Monsanto. Started as private companies, and they are providing the capital for the inventive side of it. Here's wheat. It's kicked in a little bit later, but wheat yields have been going up. This one may not be quite as encouraging, but everyone agrees that that's going to keep going at an escalating pace up in here. This was almost entirely due to chemical influence. It's Norman borlags coming along with dwarf wheat, which you could put on more nitrogen so it had higher yields. It's simple. I mean, it sounds really simple now, but it took him years to do it, and he got a Nobel Peace Prize for accomplishing that. We can't continue to pour more nitrogen on wheat. So maybe we do have a leveling there. But the world, from 1960 up to the present time, this is world grain production. It's going up. I just, it goes back to the stories in the 50s that by the turn of the century, we were going to have massive starvation, civil wars around the world. Those ideas never came into fruition because there was technology to solve the problems. I don't know, and no one would have predicted what all the technologies were back here in the 1940s and 50s, but wherever there is capital in place to support innovation, the human nature is to implement. The only thing that gets in the way, in my view, is political systems that screw it up. Pick down I'll skip that one. Well, let me just show that picture. I took these pictures in Zimbabwe last year. This is an area in sub-Saharan Africa. The women do the work. The women don't have access to capital. They are harvesting chickpeas here, putting them on a plastic sheet, separating the seed from the rest of the stuff by hand, and then carrying it off into their village. How incredibly inefficient. Now, the only place where this sort of thing has begun to change is where, and I think it's public-private partnership, philanthropy. There's a big Japanese philanthropist whose name escapes me right now. He worked with Norman Borlaug in East Africa, in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, doing microloan programs for women. So they could buy better grain, they could buy nitrogen fertilizer. Their yields doubled within 5 years. The families became more affluent, etc. All the loans were to women because they were the ones doing the work, making the decisions, etc. So that was, in a sense, a way around the political infrastructure to get directly to the people. So I wanted to just end up, which I think this is positive, but it could be a point of debate. Over here this is from the World Bank, from the World Development Index of the World Bank. It goes from 1970 to the present. Agriculture as value added around the world, total around the world, percent of GDP. A steep decline, which is going on and will continue, I believe. What this means is, on a global basis, agriculture is less important as GDP. That just means other things are increasing. Where we used to have around the world an agrarian society where 80–90% of all the income came from agriculture, today we're down at somewhere around 3% on a global scale. That means 97% of the people are making their living on something other than agriculture. The net result, net from this, is it gets more efficient. You got a smaller number of people with greater access to capital making concerted decisions together so they become more efficient. As a result, and this is for gross national income purchasing power going up from the same period from 70 up to the present, the world is going up dramatically. The one that's on here in blue is China. China's going up much faster than anybody else in the world. Now, they had a very low start, so that gives them some advantage, but they're going up dramatically. What does it mean? Well, they're part of this reason that agriculture is declining because China is really not investing proportionally as much in agriculture today as they are in building hydroelectric dams, putting industrialization in place, building highways, building cars, building airplanes, building everything else. The net that comes out of that, though, is they're getting more wealth, not necessarily uniformly distributed, but a broad number of people are getting more money. That's going to drive them to make totally different decisions about what different agricultural products they want. And I think the innovation in a country like China is going to it's going to be a financial decision by the people who want to eat food. And they're going to want to eat more pork, or more chicken, or more fish from aquaculture. It's going to be driven by economics. And they're going to use that purchasing power to go back into the agricultural system to drive agricultural improvement. So, of all this, you just look at the countries where the financial well-being of individuals is taking off. That's where agricultural innovation will come. And then lastly, here's the population of the world. So we're someplace around, here's 2010 right here. We're someplace right in here. What it says is North America, Europe, etc. are not going to change dramatically in population, but where is the population going? Sub-Saharan Africa is proportionally growing very rapidly. This is Asia in general, is where the biggest part of the population growth is occurring. So the good side is part of Asia is becoming wealthy. They're going to have money to plow into agriculture. They're going to do it from the purchasing power backwards. The bad part of it is Sub-Saharan Africa and other less developed countries around the world aren't going to have that same thing. So we're going to have major differences in our economic capacity to drive innovation in agriculture. And what I really think, and it's not what we should do, it's what we possibly can do. 40 years ago in the U.S., our foreign policy was very much focused on agricultural innovation. USAID put 40% of their budget into institution building around the world, building research centers in agriculture, colleges of agriculture. We were just talking about this.